My name is Eloise Marwood, and if you had seen me 6 months ago sitting on the front porch of my son's house with a suitcase in one hand and a quivering teacup in the other, you might have mistaken me for a woman with nowhere to go. You'd be right then. But if you saw me now sitting quietly behind the desk of a lawyer's office, while my son receives an envelope that ends his illusion of control, you might wonder how a retired librarian in her 70s managed to turn silence into strategy. Let me take you back. It started with a request, not a desperate one. No, desperate people ask with trembling hands and apologies. My son Nathan asked like he was doing me a favor. Mom, we just need a little help to get through the next phase. The baby's on the way. Health insurance won't cover the birth center. And we found this place. It's a duplex, and it's perfect. But the down payment is. He trailed off, pretending to choke up. Not that he needed to pretend. Nathan had always known how to play the edges of guilt like a piano. I looked over at his wife Kayla. Her belly was just starting to show beneath a flowing green dress. She didn't meet my eyes. She never really did. But she reached out to squeeze Nathan's hand dramatically like they were starring in a sitcom. Nobody else could see. I nodded. I'll help. That was all I said. No questions about the exact amount. No contract. No discussion. Because I was the mother. Because my husband Arthur had always said, family doesn't bill family. A week later, I transferred $182,700 into Nathan's account. It was every cent of the retirement Arthur and I had saved over 4 decades. It was the amount we had planned to use for road trips in a rusty camper that never came, and for the cottage near Lake Michigan we talked about, but never saw. It was our dream. But Arthur was gone and Nathan had asked. So I let that dream go, hoping it might become the foundation of someone else's. For a while I lived in a small spare room in their new home. Kayla called it the office, and she wasn't wrong. There was a printer beside the bed, and the only window faced a brick wall. But I made it my own, lined the shelves with old paperbacks, bought a small plant, even taught Kayla how to make mushroom soup from scratch one rainy afternoon. But over time, the kindness unraveled. Nathan grew distant. Kayla became territorial. She stopped knocking before entering. She started moving my things without asking. She called it reorganizing. Then came the whispers behind closed doors. One night I overheard Kayla say, "She's always here. It's like we don't have our own space." And Nathan, as if he had learned nothing from the man who raised him, replied, "I know. I'm working on it." Working on what? On removing me like a worn-out couch. The eviction didn't come with papers. It came with politeness. It came the next Sunday. Kayla was pretending to tidy up the living room while Nathan fidgeted with the remote. "Mom?" he said, not looking at me. "Kayla and I talked and we think, it's time you found a more suitable place to live." I blinked. I thought this was the place. Nathan smiled tightly like a used car salesman at the end of a bad month. "We just need a little more privacy. The baby's coming. We were thinking you could maybe stay at one of those nice senior apartments. There's a place not too far from here." Kayla found it. I looked at the brochure she handed me. A retirement facility. Monthly cost. $2,300. I couldn't afford a week. "I gave you everything," I whispered. Nathan stood. "And we're grateful. But you can't just stay forever, Mom. You said yourself this was temporary." No, I hadn't. I picked up the brochure. The page crinkled under my fingers. Kayla smiled, relieved it was done. And then I understood. I wasn't a mother to them anymore. I was a transaction. That night, I packed my suitcase quietly. Nathan didn't say goodbye. Kayla was in the nursery repainting the walls. I slept in a budget motel near the highway. The mattress sank in the middle. The window buzzed from a broken seal, and I stared at the ceiling, remembering every lesson I'd taught other people's children about honesty, character, and history. Funny how history always repeats itself for the ones who never studied it. The next morning, I walked to the public library where I had once worked. The new manager recognized me, gave me a smile that felt like pity, and offered me a cup of tea. But I wasn't there for comfort. I was there to print something. I dug through my purse until I found it. The tiny notepad I always carried. I flipped to the page titled, "Transfer Confirmation, Bank of Huron. Date. Amount. Recipient." I stared at the number. 182,700. And for the first time since Nathan had shut the door, I didn't feel grief. I felt calculation. I spent that afternoon walking, not to clear my head. No, that would have been too gentle, too hopeful. I walked to remind myself of every sacrifice I'd made and every blind spot I'd chosen not to see. The neighborhood I wandered through was full of places I used to know. The church thrift store where I donated Arthur's coats after he passed. The park bench where we used to share peanut butter sandwiches in silence. The corner cafe that still made scones the way I liked them until new ownership priced out the old regulars. Even the library, my sanctuary for decades, felt unfamiliar now. The computers were sleek, the walls repainted a sterile white, and the front desk staffed with people who barely remembered my name. But none of that mattered. What mattered was the moment I realized something very important. I had no home, not the spare room they kicked me from, not the motel that smelled like bleach and loneliness, not even the library that once anchored my days. I didn't belong anywhere. And yet I didn't feel broken. Instead, I felt sharp, like something dormant inside me had been filed down over years of motherhood and widowhood, now finally free to cut. The first thing I did was return to the motel and flip open the old composition book I used for budgeting. It was a holdover from my librarian days, black and white cover pages stained with ink smudges and grocery lists. I made 3 columns: current assets, monthly expenses, future options. Under current assets, I wrote $237 in checking, $40 in cash, a 20-year-old Honda Civic, a $10 Target gift card, my wedding ring, no price listed. It wasn't much, but I was a Marwood, and we didn't fold. We reorganized. That night, I found a shelter downtown. The building was old, but clean. I stood at the entrance, gripping the handle of my suitcase like it might run without me. The intake coordinator was a tired woman named Trina, with kind eyes and no patience for drama. She looked me over once, said, "You're not what usually walks through our door," and handed me a clipboard. I slept on a cot that smelled faintly of lemon disinfectant. There were 2 other women in the room. One snored, the other cried into her pillow. I didn't sleep. I planned. By morning, I had a list of temporary cleaning jobs, temp library fill-ins, and even a senior reading companion gig. It paid almost nothing, but I didn't care. I needed a routine, and more importantly, I needed to disappear from Nathan's radar long enough to work in peace. And peace was not something they were entitled to disturb anymore. 2 weeks passed. I learned the rhythm of life in the margins. Up at 5, job at 6, another job at noon. Back to the shelter by 8, write everything down by 9, sleep at 10. I stopped calling, I stopped wondering, and I stopped mourning. One night, while folding laundry in the corner of the church basement that doubled as the shelter's laundromat, I found something I'd forgotten I still carried. Tucked in the lining of my suitcase was a small envelope yellowed and sealed with my husband's initials. Arthur's handwriting, "To Eloise only if you're ever alone." I sat on a plastic chair under flickering fluorescent lights and opened it. Inside was a letter and a single key. The letter read, "If you're reading this, it means they failed you. Not because you're weak, but because they were. I've hidden the last of our savings in the safe deposit box at Bank West under your name only. It's not much, but it's yours and no one else's. Use it only if you're done asking, because you, my love, were never meant to beg. Arthur." I blinked. Twice. And then I laughed, a dry, bitter sound that echoed in the laundry room like defiance. I didn't even remember the box. It had been opened right after Arthur's funeral and never again. He must have gone back and added to it quietly over the years. The next day, I took the bus to Bank West, waited in line behind a man depositing rent checks in sweatpants. When it was my turn, I showed the key. The teller disappeared, returned 10 minutes later with a narrow steel box. Inside, $7,000 in cash, a copy of the deed to my old family cabin in Yarrow Creek, long thought sold, and a flash drive. I didn't even own a computer anymore, but I didn't need to. I knew what I had now. Enough money to restart, a legally clean property, and a digital record of something Arthur had clearly meant to use. Something I would soon discover was more powerful than even he imagined. But first, I needed to disappear. I moved out of the shelter 2 days later and into a boarding house 2 towns over. Paid cash, registered nothing in my name, changed my cell number, got a post office box, made no social media activity. To them, I was gone, but I wasn't hiding. I was plotting. The boarding house was quiet, too quiet at first. My room was on the second floor, tucked into the back, with one small window that overlooked an alley and the roof of a laundromat. The bed creaked. The wallpaper peeled, but it was mine. I paid the landlady, a woman named June, 2 months in advance. She didn't ask questions. She didn't care. In fact, she barely looked up when I handed her the cash. Perfect. Every morning, I left early, still dressed in plain work clothes and sneakers worn from years of being everyone's helper. I told people I was visiting a friend in hospice. That bought me sympathy and privacy, two things that, when combined, made me invisible. But I wasn't idle. My first stop was the public library 3 towns away from Nathan's. I got a temporary computer pass, sat down in front of a dusty screen, and slid in Arthur's flash drive. There were 5 files. The first was a scanned letter, Arthur's handwriting again. If Nathan ever puts you out, it's because he never learned what you taught him. This drive contains records I've kept for 20 years. Emails, receipts, and transfers. He borrowed from your name to pay off his debt once before. Without telling you. I didn't act on it back then because I hoped he'd change. But if he hasn't, this is your leverage. Use it how you see fit. I sat frozen in front of the screen for a full minute. Not because I was surprised. Because part of me had always known. The missing funds. The unexplained credit card alerts. The moment years ago when Arthur suggested I check our joint accounts and I shrugged it off. Nathan would never. Well, he had. And Arthur had quietly tracked every misstep. The second file was a PDF of bank records. Withdrawals made in my name. Transfers to Nathan's account labeled consulting services. Tax write-offs under my social security number. Illegal. Technically. Provable. Definitely. The third file was an email thread between Nathan and a debt resolution firm. The timestamp was 2 weeks before he asked me for the retirement money. The fourth was a scanned copy of the original deed to the Yarrow Creek cabin, an asset Arthur had transferred solely into my name, but never told Nathan about. That I realized now was my shield. If Nathan had continued the abuse, I'd still have something no one could take. The fifth file. A simple video. Arthur seated at our old kitchen table, speaking directly into the camera. Eloise, if you're watching this, it means he didn't come through. You gave him life. He gave you a hallway and a deadline. So now take what's yours. And don't apologize for it. And if you ever feel guilty, remember this. Dignity is not something they can gift you back once they've stripped it. You have to reclaim it. That's when I cried. Not because I was hurt. Because I was ready. I left the library and caught the next bus downtown. And I did something I hadn't done in years. I made an appointment with a lawyer. Not just any lawyer. I found someone young, sharp, and ambitious. Her name was Celia Torres, and she happened to be the daughter of one of my former library volunteers. She remembered me. I remembered her. We met in her sleek office with floor-to-ceiling windows and a table made of glass. I'm not suing him, I said. She nodded. Then what are we doing? I want to disappear while buying his house. Her eyes lit up. That, she said, is doable. I handed her a copy of the mortgage deed I had secretly accessed during my shelter days. Nathan and Kayla had refinanced recently, an aggressive move that meant they were over-leveraged. I explained my plan. She smiled slowly, then leaned back in her chair. I can make this happen. Quietly. Through a holding company. You'll need to act fast, though. I've waited long enough. We filed the paperwork within days. The house would go into foreclosure within 6 weeks, due to missed payments. Nathan, it seemed, had used my retirement to pay off short-term debts, but never accounted for long-term costs. Celia helped me buy the foreclosure rights through an LLC, anonymous, legally clean. I paid with Arthur's funds plus a silent partner. The sale of the Yarrow Creek cabin. I hadn't planned on letting it go. But as I stood in front of that worn wooden porch one last time, I realized that place belonged to the past. What I was building now needed no ghosts. Back at the boarding house, I waited. 3 weeks later, the purchase went through. The deed was mine. The house my son thought he owned, the house he kicked me out of now. legally belonged to a quiet woman named Eloise who no longer lived under his roof but inside his blind spot. And I still wasn't done. The next move wasn't about paperwork. It was about timing. Because revenge, at least the kind I believe in, is not a loud slam of the door. It's the whisper you don't hear, until everything around you starts to collapse. I waited 6 more days before mailing the letter. Just one envelope. Inside was a formal notification of ownership transfer from the holding company prepared and signed by Celia, along with a copy of the deed and a polite note. Please vacate the premises within 30 days. As per the foreclosure and acquisition of title, the property is no longer under your ownership. Sincerely, Marwood Holdings LLC. No signature, no personal touches, just cold clinical truth. Exactly the tone they had used with me. I didn't send it directly to Nathan. I sent it to Kayla. Because Kayla was the one who thought politeness was power. Because Kayla was the one who looked at me like a burden with a heartbeat. It arrived on a Tuesday. I know this because Wednesday morning Celia called me from her office, barely hiding her amusement. Your daughter-in-law just left me a voicemail. She's very upset. Did she sound confused? She sounded like she swallowed a wasp, and then tried to blame the wasp for flying too close. I smiled for the first time in weeks. That evening, I sat by the tiny window in my boarding house room and sipped a cup of tea. Not fancy tea. Not flavored or organic or blessed by Himalayan monks. Just plain black tea steeped too long in water that never quite boiled. But it tasted like dignity. The next few days were oddly quiet. I expected Nathan to call or yell, or at least send one of his passive-aggressive texts, those long, breathy paragraphs that danced around the word sorry like it might bite him. But he didn't, because deep down he was afraid. He'd always been afraid of silence. That's why he talked so much. That's why he turned every confrontation into a lecture about what you don't understand, Mom. But this time, there was nothing to misunderstand. The numbers spoke. The deed spoke. And I didn't have to. Friday came. I received a message. Not from Nathan. From my grandson, Sam. It was a shaky video message. He was 8. His face filled the screen. Grandma, Mommy and Daddy are really mad and keep talking about you. I don't know why, but I miss you. Can I see you sometime? I watched it 5 times. Then I wrote him a letter, handwritten, sealed in a blue envelope, slipped through the postbox at dawn. Dear Sam, grown-ups don't always make sense, do they? Sometimes they forget that love isn't a house or a car or even a big backyard. It's time. It's showing up. It's reading a book together on a rainy day. I miss you too. And when the grown-ups stop being angry, I hope we can do that again. Love, Grandma Eloise. Then I included a copy of his favorite book, The Wind in the Willows, and circled his name in the dedication page. No matter what Nathan and Kayla had decided, Sam deserved to know I hadn't vanished. That afternoon, Celia and I met for coffee. She handed me a new set of documents, confirmation of the house transfer, as well as a statement from the moving company already on standby. Do you want to wait the full 30 days? No, I said. Give them 14. Let them decide whether to pack with pride or panic. She nodded. You're colder than I thought you'd be, Mrs. Marwood. Not cold, I replied. Just finally at room temperature. I returned to the boarding house and waited. 4 days later it happened. Kayla called first. I didn't answer. Then Nathan called, and texted, and emailed, and then finally showed up. Not at the boarding house, at the library. I had returned to part-time work as a substitute archivist in a town so far removed from his world that I almost didn't recognize him when he walked in. He stood at the front desk holding his phone, eyes wide. Mom. I looked up carefully, sliding a reference book back onto the shelf. He looked like a man who had slept in his car. His shirt was wrinkled, his eyes bloodshot. What are you doing here? I asked, calm. You can't do this. I already did. He rubbed his face. I don't understand. Why would you? I cut him off. You took everything I had and told me to live in a shelter. His mouth opened, but no words came. I didn't scream, I said. I didn't curse you. I didn't show up with lawyers or reporters or Facebook posts. I just left. Quietly. I thought he began. You didn't think I said, that's the point. He looked around as if the dusty shelves might offer him sanctuary. I have a child. So did I. He flinched. That was the first moment he understood what he had done, not just to me, but to the idea of me. You can't just evict your family, he muttered. You're right. You shouldn't. But you did. And then I walked away. Not in anger, not in victory, but with the steady certainty of someone who had finally stopped asking for permission to matter. The movers arrived on a rainy Thursday morning. I wasn't there to see it, of course, but Celia texted me a photo. A white truck parked in the driveway, two men in uniforms wheeling out boxes, and in the background, Nathan standing under a half-broken umbrella, one hand on his hip, the other holding his phone as if trying to dial his way out of a story he wrote himself. I stared at the photo for a long time. Then I deleted it. I had no interest in keeping snapshots of someone else's regret. The truth was, I didn't need to watch it unfold. I didn't need to witness the packing, the pleading, the rationalizing, because I had already lived through that once from the other side of the glass. And back then, no one looked out the window. Celia sent me the final paperwork a few days later. The house had been vacated, the keys returned, the locks changed, the property title updated with my name, my real name, not the LLC restored to the deed. She called to ask if I wanted to move in. No, I said. You don't want to keep it? I want to own it. I don't want to live there. She paused, then laughed softly. You're something else, Mrs. Marwood. Thank you. That's new. I transferred the property into a trust that would one day go to Sam. Not yet, he was still too young and his parents were still too loud. But someday, if he became the kind of man who remembered story time and birthday cards, he would find a home waiting for him, one they couldn't touch. In the meantime, I rented it to a couple with a baby girl and a tabby cat. They paid on time. They waved at the mailman. And the wife planted sunflowers in the garden bed Kayla once called too old-fashioned. It was perfect. Nathan tried to reach me again through Celia, through email, even through a letter he left at the library. The letter was long, dramatic, and full of half-apologies woven between excuses. He wrote about pressure, stress, feeling trapped, and not knowing how to ask for help. Funny. He'd known exactly how to ask when he needed my money. I didn't respond. But I didn't destroy the letter either. I folded it neatly and placed it inside the same envelope that once held Arthur's handwritten note. Let them live together. Let memory and consequence share a drawer. Weeks passed. The boarding house began to feel like more than just a place I slept. It became a space where I could read, again, think again, and walk into a room without feeling like I was stealing someone else's air. I even started writing letters to other women at the shelter, small notes of encouragement tucked into donated paperbacks or slipped between packets of tea. Sometimes you don't need to shout to be heard. Sometimes kindness like justice is most powerful when it's quiet and deliberate. One Saturday morning, I went to the farmer's market. A little girl was handing out lavender bundles tied with twine. Smell it, she said, holding one up to me. It makes you feel calm. I did. And it did. I bought 3. That afternoon, I returned to the house, my house, for the first time since reclaiming it. I didn't go inside. I stood in the garden. The sunflowers were blooming. The soil looked freshly turned. A child's tricycle leaned against the porch. I walked to the edge of the garden, knelt and planted the lavender. One bundle at each corner of the garden bed, and the last in the middle right where the hydrangeas used to be. Then I stood up, brushed the dirt from my hands, and left. That evening, Sam called me. His voice was quiet. Careful. Mom said you don't want to talk to them. I smiled even though he couldn't see me. That's true. Why? Because grown-ups don't always do the right thing, sweetheart. Do you still love me? That hurt more than all of it. More than anything, I said. And nothing will ever change that. He was silent a moment. Then, I miss reading stories. I took a breath. Steady. I'm going to send you a book, I said. And every page you turn, I'll be turning mine too. He didn't say anything else, but I heard him sniffle. And I knew in that moment that not everything had to be burned to be rebuilt. Some things just needed distance and time. The seasons changed quietly, as they tend to do when no one's watching. Summer bowed out. Autumn crept in with its soft golden hush, and the streets turned the color of cider and rust. I stayed at the boarding house through it all, renewed my rent without hesitation. Not because I couldn't afford something better by now, I could, but because I'd come to understand the value of small spaces that feel honest. I made routines for myself, simple ones: morning walks at the reservoir, afternoon tea in the community kitchen, Friday nights reading old poetry collections at the local library where they'd given me a key and a quiet title: volunteer archivist emeritus. It was a peaceful life, but peace, I learned, wasn't always silent. Sometimes it whispered through decisions. And I was about to make another one. It started with a conversation I hadn't meant to overhear. The laundry room again. Two women much younger than me folding towels and trading burdens like poker cards. One said he told me to get out if I couldn't pay rent. And I had paid. I just paid late. The other replied, "That's how they do it. Shame you first. Then shove you out before anyone notices." I stayed silent behind the washing machines, my hands soaked from a leaky hose, my eyes fixed on the suds, because I remembered that feeling. Being reduced to an inconvenience, being treated like a cost. And for what? Because I aged, because I trusted. That night, I wrote another letter. Not to Sam, to a bank, a different one. I wanted to open a new account under the name the Ellison Fund, Arthur's middle name, my mother's maiden name. It would be a quiet account, private, modest, but its purpose would be clear: emergency funds for elderly women in transition. No press, no public foundation gala, just quiet deposits for quiet exits. When the bank manager asked why, I told him the truth. Because sometimes all it takes is $500 to keep someone from crumbling. He didn't ask for more. But the young teller, a girl with nervous hands and a sunflower tattoo behind her ear, slipped me a thank you note folded inside my receipt. "You remind me of my grandma. She helped everyone too. They never thanked her either." I began donating anonymously to shelters in neighboring towns. I chose the ones that didn't have shiny websites or Christmas campaigns. The ones that asked for toothbrushes instead of plaques. I visited once a week. Sometimes I delivered books. Sometimes I just sat in the common room and listened. No one ever asked who I was, which is how I knew I belonged. And then, on the first Thursday of October, I got another letter. From Kayla. It was handwritten, which surprised me. 3 pages, neatly folded, tucked into an envelope that smelled faintly of baby powder. "Eloise, I've spent the last few months trying to justify what we did. The truth is, I can't. I was wrong. You didn't deserve what we did to you. We were selfish, scared, and arrogant. And you were just trying to help. Nathan still doesn't know how to talk to you. He wants to, but he doesn't know how. Sam keeps asking about you. I know you probably won't answer, and I understand. But I wanted you to know, I think of you every time I walk past the empty garden. And every time I see lavender, I hope you're well. Kayla." I read it twice, once with a curled lip, once with a softened heart. Then I placed it beside Nathan's letter in the same drawer. Let them sit together. Let them whisper apologies to each other in the dark. I wasn't going to respond. Not yet. But I didn't throw it away, because there was a part of me that wondered maybe one day, not soon, but someday, I'd invite Sam to plant a lavender bed of his own. And when he did, maybe Kayla would visit. Not as family, but as someone learning how to grow something again. In the meantime, I lived. I found an old camera at a thrift shop and began taking photos of little moments. A leaf balanced on a bench, a cup of tea with steam curling into sunlight, a cat asleep in a windowsill, its fur pressed against a library sticker. I didn't share them with anyone. They were just mine, proof that I was still here, still seeing, still healing. And when winter came, I bought new boots with soft insoles and strong laces. I wore them like armor. I walked like the world couldn't hurt me anymore. Because it couldn't, because I'd already learned the hardest truth of all. Sometimes the ones who throw you out are giving you the key to walk into something better. There was one thing I hadn't done yet. One place I hadn't returned to. The cemetery. Arthur had been gone 8 years. His headstone was simple. Arthur James Marwood, 1945-2017. He read, he loved, he listened. I had chosen that inscription. I remembered standing there in the middle of that cold October, clutching the note card I'd scribbled it on. No poems, no verses, just truth. And now, 8 years later, I stood there again, older, quieter, heavier in wisdom, but lighter in weight. I brought with me 3 things. A photo of Sam, the one he'd drawn of us reading together under a tree. A single lavender stalk from the garden I'd replanted. And the keys to the house Nathan lost. I placed the photo in a small envelope and tucked it into the stone vase beside Arthur's grave. The lavender followed. The keys. I held them for a moment, then closed my fist. Arthur, I said quietly, he didn't change. But I did. There was no wind that day. No birdsong. No dramatic sign. Just stillness. And a very particular kind of peace that doesn't announce itself. It just settles. On my way home, I stopped by the post office. Inside my box was a postcard. No return address. Just a child's handwriting. Dear Grandma, I read chapter 4 without you, but I saved chapter 5. I want to read it together next week. Love, Sam. I sat down right there on the bench outside, tears forming before I could stop them. He remembered. He waited. He still believed there was something worth saving. And maybe that was enough. The next morning, I packed a small bag. Not the kind of bag you take when you're fleeing. The kind you pack when you know where you're going and why. 2 books, 1 sweater, and the spare pair of glasses Sam had once pretended were wizard lenses. I wrote a short letter to the woman currently renting my house. I'll be away for a week. Please water the garden. If the lavender begins to bloom, leave one for the boy at 43 Wexford Drive. He'll know who it's from. The train ride was long and soft. The kind where the world outside blurs and people around you exist only in silhouette and station names. When I arrived in the town where Sam now lived, I didn't go straight to the house. I checked into a small inn, wrote postcards, walked through the bookstore where I once bought Nathan his first Hardy Boys novel. And then the next day I waited outside Sam's school. When the bell rang, children scattered like bright marbles across the sidewalk. And there he was, a little taller, same backpack, same habit of walking with his head tilted like he was listening to an invisible narrator. He looked up, saw me, froze. Then without a word he ran, straight into my arms. We didn't say much. We didn't need to. We sat on the school bench, pulled out chapter 5 and began to read. His small hand resting on mine, my voice steady, his eyes wide. And for that half hour, nothing else in the world mattered. Not betrayal, not titles, not who lost or won, just the rhythm of words and the silence between them. Later that evening, I received a call from an unknown number. I didn't answer, but the voicemail was from Nathan, his voice unusually quiet. I heard you saw Sam today. I guess I should say something, but I don't know what. You were always better at knowing what to do when it mattered. If you ever want to talk, you can, or not. I'll understand. I saved the message. Didn't reply. Because forgiveness, I've learned, isn't something you announce. It's something you wear, quietly. Like a coat you stitched yourself after the storm passed. I stayed in town for 5 days. Read 2 more chapters with Sam. Taught him how to fold paper into a perfect swan. And on the last day, we planted a new lavender sprig outside his bedroom window. He asked why. So it always smells like Grandma, I said. He giggled. And books? Exactly. When I returned to the boarding house, a small package was waiting for me. No note, just a wooden box. Inside it, a pair of reading glasses, Nathan's old pair, the ones Arthur once wore and handed down, and a sticky note scribbled in all caps. You always saw clearer than I did. Maybe these will help me now. I placed them on my nightstand. Didn't cry, didn't smile, just let them be. Because now I understood. The greatest revenge isn't taking something back. It's reclaiming yourself in full view and not needing anyone's permission to stay whole. There's a peculiar kind of power that comes with no longer needing to be understood. It doesn't arrive with trumpets or some grand epiphany. It comes slowly like light through an old curtain until you realize you no longer flinch when someone speaks your name with expectation. You no longer ache when your phone doesn't ring. That's where I was. Free. And not just from them, but from myself. From the version of Eloise Marwood who needed to be wanted, needed to be needed. The version who would have rather slept on the floor than made someone uncomfortable in their own home. She was gone. and in her place stood someone else, someone whole. In early November, I visited the house one last time. Not for closure, not even for nostalgia, but because the couple renting it had asked if I'd like to stop by for tea. The woman Claire greeted me in the doorway with flour on her hands and a toddler on her hip. The man Jonah was in the kitchen baking banana bread from a recipe clipped to the fridge. They had made the house a home, not a stage, not a status symbol, just a place of warmth. I looked around and smiled. The hallway where Kayla once scolded me for leaving my slippers out now held muddy boots and a diaper bag. The window that faced the garden had new curtains hand-sewn with tiny birds embroidered on the hem. Claire poured tea. Jonah offered slices of bread still warm from the oven. The toddler handed me a plastic dinosaur with the reverence of a holy relic. And for the first time since I reclaimed the deed, I truly let go. Not because I didn't deserve it, because I no longer needed to prove that I did. As I walked out into the backyard, I noticed something new. The lavender I'd planted months ago had bloomed fully tall, pale purple stalks stretching toward the sky. Beside them, Claire had planted new flowers. Wild daisies, marigolds, and tiny blue forget-me-nots. I bent down, running my fingers gently over the soil. It was soft, rich, freshly turned. And then I saw it. A small wooden sign nestled into the earth, in memory of the woman who planted this garden with silence and strength. My breath caught. I hadn't told them the full story. I hadn't needed to, but they saw it anyway. Later that evening, I returned to my room at the boarding house and opened a fresh journal. On the first page I wrote, "I am not who they remember. I am who I decided to become once they forgot me." And then I began writing the stories of the women I'd met at the shelters. Not their names, not their full truths, just their moments of strength when they walked out, when they stood up, when they chose themselves. Each page became a kind of quiet revolution. I didn't know what I'd do with it yet. Maybe nothing. Maybe everything. That weekend, I visited a small church in a neighboring town, not to pray, but to listen. A group of women had gathered there for something called the Forgotten Daughters Circle. No agenda, no platform, just tea stories in space. They welcomed me without hesitation. I shared just one sentence. I used to be invisible. Then I bought the house they tried to erase me from. The room went still. Then soft smiles, nods, eyes glistening with something that wasn't pity, recognition. And that's when I knew. What happened to me wasn't just mine. It was ours. The script of silence written on the backs of mothers, grandmothers, aunts, those who gave everything only to be folded like old letters and left in drawers. But no more. By December, I had drafted a plan. Nothing grand. Just a network of small emergency stipends. No paperwork. No humiliation. Just trust. Women helping women. It would begin with me. Then Claire. Then someone Claire knew. And so on. Not viral. Not flashy. But real, one woman at a time. I visited Sam again before Christmas. We didn't talk about Nathan or Kayla. We just baked gingerbread cookies, laughed at how terrible mine looked, and spent the evening reading under a quilt. At the end of the night, he leaned over and whispered, "Do you think stories can save people?" I didn't even pause. "Yes," I said. "Especially the true ones." He smiled. "Then I want to write mine one day." "You already are?" I whispered, brushing the crumbs from his cheek. "You already are." And as I lay in bed that night, warm beneath layers of patchwork and moonlight, I realized something simple and beautiful. They had tried to make me small, but I grew anyway, not out of revenge, but out of reclamation. And no one, not even the ones who named me mother and then forgot, could take that from me again. The holidays came and went with quiet grace. No grand dinners, no glittering trees stacked with gifts, just the gentle hum of a life reassembled, one cup of tea, one sunrise, one letter at a time. On Christmas Eve, I found myself at the shelter downtown, not because I needed to be, but because I wanted to be. The volunteers there had become a second kind of family, one born not from obligation, but from recognition. We baked cookies with cracked edges, strung popcorn onto thread, and handed out wool socks like they were gold. One woman, a soft-spoken retiree named Agnes, hugged me after I slipped a folded $100 bill into her coat pocket. She didn't say thank you. She said, "You remembered I exist." And in those 4 words, I heard every version of myself I had once been unseen, unheard, folded up like a favor too long given. A few days later, Claire from the house called. "We found something in the attic," she said, voice hushed. It was behind the insulation. "I think it was meant for you." I drove out that same afternoon. When I arrived, Jonah handed me a weathered leather-bound book tied shut with a single fraying ribbon. No label, no date. Just my name on the front cover in Arthur's unmistakable handwriting. "Eloise. Only when it's all behind you." I didn't open it at the house. I waited until I returned to the boarding room. Waited until the lavender oil diffuser had filled the air. Until the streetlights flickered like slow blinks. Then I untied the ribbon and turned the first page. Inside was a journal. Arthur's journal. Not of his life, but of mine. Page after page he had written down moments, some trivial, some enormous, that I had long forgotten. She stayed up until 2 a.m. editing a grant proposal for a student who never said thank you. Today she gave away her own coat to the new neighbor because a child comes first. I watched her make dinner for 4 and say she wasn't hungry, so everyone else could have seconds. She laughs when she reads. Cries when no one sees. She forgets herself faster than she forgets anyone else. And at the very end, if you're reading this, L, it means you survived what I feared most. Being used up by the people you loved the most. But if you're reading this, it also means you did something I always knew you would. You chose yourself. Finally. And for that, you've never made me prouder. I don't know how long I sat there. The pages blurred, the room blurred, everything softened into one long, aching exhale. He had seen me even in the spaces where I thought I'd disappeared. And somehow, all these years later, he was still handing me back to myself, word by word. The next day, I visited the house one final time, not to walk the halls or check the mailbox, to plant something. I brought a rose bush white like the one Arthur had planted outside our first apartment when Nathan was born. Claire and Jonah helped me dig the hole. Sam, who was visiting with his father for the weekend, stood beside me holding the watering can. "You're making another memory, aren't you?" he asked. "Yes," I said, pressing the roots into the earth. "But this time it's one I want to keep." He smiled. Then he did something that caught me off guard. He handed me a small envelope. Inside was a note written in red crayon. "When I grow up, I want to be brave like you." No signature, just a drawing of a flower, a house, and a woman standing in the middle holding a book. That night, I framed it. Not because I needed to remember who I was, but because I wanted to remember who I'd become. The kind of woman who could be erased, betrayed, forgotten, and still bloom. It was the last Sunday of the year. A quiet gray day, the kind that wraps the sky in wool and makes everything seem suspended like the world is waiting for something to break the stillness. I sat by the window of my boarding room, sipping lukewarm tea, watching the clouds roll by like slow-moving regrets. I had no plans, no resolutions. No new year, new me mantras. Because I wasn't new, I was restored. And that kind of transformation doesn't need a calendar to mark it. Around noon, I took a walk. The town square was mostly empty. A few families braved the chill, bundled in scarves and mittens, laughing at pigeons and chasing memory, like it was something they could hold in gloved hands. I passed a man playing violin near the fountain. The music was imperfect notes bending like willow branches, but there was something beautiful in the imperfection. I dropped a $5 bill into his case and said, "You made silence feel warm." He nodded as if he understood exactly what I meant. Later that evening, I received an unexpected visitor. Not Nathan, not Kayla, Celia. She stood in the hallway outside my door holding a wrapped package and wearing a grin far too proud for someone in heels on a Sunday night. "I thought you might want to see this," she said, handing it to me. Inside was a copy of a legal journal. The headline read, "From Eviction to Empowerment, a case study in quiet ownership." My story. Well, not mine exactly. A sanitized, anonymized version Celia had submitted under a pseudonym detailing how a retired woman leveraged quiet, legal maneuvering to reclaim property and agency. "I changed your name, your town, everything," she said quickly. "But the heart of it, That's yours. I sat down, flipping through pages. The words didn't feel like revenge. They felt like legacy, like something that would ripple through courtrooms and conversation, offering women like me a playbook that didn't require shouting. You inspired me, she said softly, more than any class I ever took. I looked at her, this young woman with law degrees and sharp edges, and saw a mirror of what I might have been in another life. And yet, I wouldn't change a thing. Because even if it came late, I had learned the quietest power of all: to live without needing to be anyone's version of right. The next morning, I found a letter tucked under my door. From Nathan. It wasn't handwritten. Not this time. Typed. Formatted. Double-spaced. As if he thought clarity might make the difference. Mom. I saw Sam's drawing. The one with the house and the woman holding a book. I know who that is. And I also know now what I did. What we did. You don't have to forgive me. I wouldn't if I were you. But I want to be better. For Sam. And if someday you ever feel like you can talk to me again, I'll be here. Not with explanations. Just with ears. Love. Nathan. I folded the letter, slid it beside the others. Not out of anger, but because I needed more time. And time was finally mine to choose. In the days that followed, I returned to the lavender garden one final time before the snow set in. The stalks had browned at the edges, but they still stood tall like survivors. I trimmed them, gently whispered a few words to the soil, and left behind a small wooden marker. Here bloomed everything they thought I buried. No name, no date. Just that. And as I turned to leave, I saw Sam's small figure at the fence line, watching silently, bundled in a too big scarf. He didn't say anything, just raised a mittened hand in a wave. I waved back. And that was enough. Because even though I had given him my money, even though they told me to go live in a shelter, I had built something stronger than a house. I had built a life where no one could throw me out ever again. January arrived like a whisper. No grand fireworks. No ball drops. Just frost curling at the edges of the windows and the low, comforting hum of radiators doing their slow, steady work. I never used to notice winter like this. When I lived with Nathan and Kayla, winters were loud, chaotic, demanding, always filled with the next holiday event, the next thing to prepare for, to decorate, to clean. But this year, winter was soft, like a page turned carefully so as not to wake the story sleeping between the lines. I began teaching again, not full-time, not even part-time. Just quietly, a few afternoons each week at the local literacy center. Most of my students were women in their 50s and 60s. Many had never learned to read properly. Others had forgotten life had made them choose survival over poetry. We sat in a circle, read aloud syllable by syllable, celebrated every sentence like it was a miracle. One woman, Maria, broke into tears when she read an entire paragraph without stopping. "Why am I crying?" she whispered. "Because you just reclaimed your voice," I said. She smiled through tears. "It's been waiting so long." I understood that feeling. On one of those winter afternoons after class, I passed by a second-hand shop. Inside the window, an antique brooch in the shape of a small open book. I bought it, pinned it to my coat, and every time someone asked, "What's that?" I simply said, "A reminder." Sam and I continued exchanging letters. He had started drawing comic strips now, stories of a little owl with big glasses who lived in a treehouse library and helped lost animals find their way home. I kept every one, framed a few, taped one above my desk that read, "The owl never yells, but he always knows." One cold Saturday morning, I received an envelope in the mail. No name, just a return address from a local high school. Inside, a thank you note from a student I didn't know, thanking me for covering their tuition for a creative writing program. I hadn't done it directly. I'd sent the money to the school through the Ellison Fund with no explanation, no names. But somehow they found me anyway, and the letter ended with something that caught me off guard. They told me the scholarship came from someone who knew what it meant to lose everything and still write her way back. I want to be that kind of writer too. Celia invited me to speak at a small legal workshop for women in transition, divorced, displaced, or discarded by the people they trusted. At first I declined. I didn't want to be anyone's symbol. But then I thought of Arthur, of that journal, of every moment he'd quietly witnessed and recorded. And I knew This wasn't about pride. It was about offering a map. I wore my brooch, stood at the front of a classroom filled with women clutching legal pads like life preservers. And I told them the story, not the glossy version, but the one with all the jagged pieces still sharp. They didn't ask questions when I finished. They applauded. And one woman said, "You didn't just survive. You rerouted the storm." I smiled. "No," I said. "I became the storm. And then I turned it into a garden." Later that week, I received a package from Kayla. Just a small box. Inside, a photo of Sam reading on the porch surrounded by books. A pair of knitted mittens, lavender, of course. And a short note. "You were right. About what matters. I'm learning." No apology. But maybe that was enough. Because learning like lavender doesn't bloom all at once. I made my way to the garden again one early morning. The air was sharp. The frost clung to everything like memory. But under the surface, I knew the roots were waiting. They always are. Because healing isn't loud. It's not fireworks or dramatic apologies or perfect endings. It's showing up, planting again, even in frozen ground, and believing that somewhere beneath the silence, something is about to bloom. February arrived with its usual indecision sun. One day, snow the next, as if the sky itself couldn't commit to healing or holding on. I didn't mind. I had stopped looking for signs in the weather. I found them instead in smaller things. A cup left out for someone without being asked. A child's laughter echoing in a hallway. The quiet hush after someone finally tells the truth, and it lands softly. Not like a bomb, but like a blanket. These moments I collected like pressed flowers, delicate but enduring. One such moment came in the form of a knock. Not loud, not urgent, just a patient tap at the door. When I opened it, Nathan stood there. No suite, no umbrella. Just a worn gray coat, unshaven chin, and eyes that looked like they hadn't rested in years. "I'm not here to ask for anything," he said quickly. "Good," I replied. He nodded, shifting his weight. Then he held out a small bag. "I brought tea. The kind you used to drink when Dad was still alive. I found it at that old market near Willow Street." I didn't take the bag. Not yet. Instead, I stepped aside. "5 minutes," I said. He looked surprised, but stepped inside. The boarding house smelled like cinnamon and old paper, the kind of scent that wraps around your shoulders before you even sit down. He looked around like he was walking through a memory he didn't know he'd forgotten. We sat. I poured us each a cup of tea, not the one he brought. And we let silence stretch between us like a bridge. Finally, he spoke. "Sam talks about you every week. He's started writing poems. Said he wants to be like you." "He already is," I said. He nodded. Took a sip. I read Dad's journal. Kayla found a copy. Apparently, he'd printed some pages and hidden them in his old records. He looked down. I didn't know how much he saw. He saw everything I said, and still gave you the benefit of the doubt. Nathan winced. "I don't deserve it." "No," I said gently, "but you have a choice. You can let that be your ending or your beginning." He looked at me, eyes misted. "Do you forgive me?" I paused. Not for drama, but because forgiveness isn't a yes or no question. "I forgave you the day I walked away," I said, "because I had to, for me, but trusting you, that takes longer." He nodded. "I'll wait." Before he left, he placed the tea on the counter, and as he turned to go, I said, "You forgot something." He looked back. "The garden," I said. "It's still blooming." Quietly. "Maybe you should see it." He hesitated, then nodded. "Someday," he said. A few days later, I hosted a reading circle in the small community center near the library. Not just for the women I'd been teaching, but for their daughters, nieces, and granddaughters. 3 generations of voices in one room. We read aloud, laughed, shared cookies. One woman brought her mother's diary and read from it like it was scripture. When it came time for me to read, I chose a poem I'd written the night Arthur's journal arrived. They tried to fold me into silence, like a letter never meant to be opened. But I wrote my name on the wind, and waited. And now, even the quiet has learned to carry my voice. There was no applause, just breath, and sometimes breath is louder than clapping. That night, as I walked home beneath the stars, I realized something simple and final. I was no longer afraid of being forgotten, because I had finally remembered myself. Not the mother, not the wife, not the burden or the guest. Me, Eloise Marwood. A woman who gave, a woman who lost, a woman who left, and a woman who returned. Not to them, but to herself. Spring came early that year. The snow melted with a kind of gentleness I hadn't seen in a while, as though the earth itself had decided not to make a scene of its thawing. Trees bloomed in sudden bursts. The lavender I had once planted in silence began to hum again in color. Everything felt softer, except me. I didn't feel hard, but I felt clear, like glass just polished, like language finally said out loud after years of nods and closed mouths. One morning, as I was sweeping the community center hallway, I found something tucked behind the bulletin board. A photograph, old, slightly yellowed at the corners. A woman gray-haired smiling at a younger version of herself in a mirror. On the back someone had written, "To remember the girl who became the woman," and didn't apologize for either. I pinned it to the corkboard. No frame, no comment. By that afternoon, 5 more photos appeared beside it. Each of a different woman, each one untouched, captioned only with memory. A quiet wall began to form. We called it the Gallery of Return. That same week, Claire stopped by the community center. She had a request. "Would you consider letting us use the house garden for the neighborhood? A space for kids to plant things, to learn how to tend to something." I blinked, not out of resistance, but awe. "That's what I always hoped it would become," I said. "Not a monument, a seedbed." We named it the Marwood Patch, not after me, but after Arthur. His name was carved into a wooden sign with tiny floral designs etched by the children themselves. Sam visited soon after. He ran through the rows of marigolds and lavender barefoot and fearless, holding a notebook filled with what he called flower spells. He sat beside me on the garden bench and asked, "Do flowers know who planted them?" I looked at him. "I think they remember hands more than names." He nodded seriously as if filing that away. Then he handed me a folded page. "A poem. My grandma walks without sound, but the ground listens. My grandma speaks like water, but it makes things grow. If you think she's not there, look for lavender." I didn't cry. I breathed it in, because sometimes tears aren't enough. Sometimes breath is the only way to carry beauty without breaking. Later that week, Nathan came to the garden. He didn't announce himself, didn't knock on the center door. He just stood at the gate. I saw him through the kitchen window standing like a man who wasn't sure if he was trespassing or home. I walked out to meet him. He held out a trowel. I thought maybe I could help dig. I said nothing, just handed him a pair of gloves. And we planted side by side, quiet, rhythmic, no words needed. Because some things are too broken for language, and some silences are softer than forgiveness. That night, I returned to my room. On my nightstand sat the old tea bag Nathan had brought on his first visit. I had never opened it, never trusted the gesture. But now, I brewed a cup, not to accept the past, not to erase it, but to acknowledge I had outgrown the bitterness. It tasted earthy, familiar, less sweet than I remembered, but warmer, like something steeped in time. At the library, I added a new entry to my journal project, a page titled, "Things They Can't Take Back." My peace, my garden, my grandson's laugh, my own name spoken in my own voice, my ability to walk away and build again. I signed it with a new pen. The ink bled slightly, like memory always does. At the next community circle, I read aloud from a collection of anonymous submissions. One woman had written, "My husband left me with the bills and the dog, but I kept the dog, and now he loves me more." We laughed. But not the sad kind, the victorious kind. The kind that says, "I'm still here." Before I left that evening, someone slipped me a note. "You remind me of who I was before I stopped choosing myself." I didn't look for the sender. I didn't need to, because I recognized the handwriting. It was mine 10 years ago, scrawled in a margin of a journal I donated to the center. And that's when I knew. I hadn't just reclaimed a house, or silence, or justice. I had reclaimed my echo, and echoes once returned to you never leave. There are certain sounds that never leave you. The rustle of pages being turned in a quiet room, the clink of a spoon against a teacup as someone prepares something just right, The whisper of someone saying your name like it still belongs to them. I had stopped reacting to that last one, because by now I knew the truth. A name is not a leash, it's a legacy, and I had chosen to build mine deliberately, one decision, one silence, one refusal at a time. In early April, the garden held its first official Community Bloom Day. Children arrived in rain boots and mismatched gloves, dragging watering cans and pouches of seeds. Women brought clippings from their own gardens. Men trimmed hedges and offered gentle instruction. Even the local high schoolers came by volunteering for credit, but staying long after the hours had been signed off. I sat on the bench near the lilacs watching. Nathan stood off to the side, uncertain, holding a tray of seed starters. He hadn't said much since the last time we planted together. But his presence was different now, less performative, more present. I could feel him trying, and in its own way that was louder than an apology. Sam darted through the rows holding a sign he had made. This garden is for everyone who ever thought they were nothing. He taped it to the gate. The wind tried to tug it loose, but it held, like I had. After the crowd thinned and the last sunflower bulb had been placed, I walked the perimeter. Near the edge, I found a new plot untouched. A small sign stuck into the earth, reserved for her, underneath a single packet of seeds. Forget-me-nots. No one claimed credit, but the handwriting, Celia's. I smiled. Then I knelt and began to dig. The next week, the town paper ran a small story. Former librarian transforms garden into sanctuary for silent survivors. They had interviewed Claire, a few students, one elderly woman who said she found her feet again somewhere between the rose bush and the picnic table. They asked if I'd give a statement. I wrote one line: "You don't have to make noise to matter. You just have to stay." They printed it at the end beneath the photo of me holding a book in one hand and a trowel in the other. Around that time, I began receiving letters from women in other towns, other states. Some had heard the story from Celia's workshop. Others had seen the article. A few had simply stumbled upon the lavender planted in their own communities and traced it back through whispers, volunteers, and kindness to me. They wrote things like, "I thought I was alone. I forgot I was allowed to leave. You reminded me I don't owe them silence." I kept every letter, stored them in a wooden box Arthur once used for his gardening tools. I called it my root chest. In late April, Kayla came to the garden, alone. I saw her standing at the edge, unsure if she was allowed to enter. I walked to meet her. She held a small pot in her hands inside a tiny blooming violet. "I brought this," she said. "I know it's not lavender." "It doesn't have to be," I replied. She looked around, took in the children, the raised beds, the chalk drawings on the sidewalk. "This wasn't supposed to happen," she whispered. "No," I agreed. "You had a different plan." She turned toward me. "I'm sorry." I studied her. Not her words, her posture, her eyes, the space between her and the guilt she hadn't quite named. "I know," I said. "But I'm not here to be apologized to. I'm here to grow." She nodded slowly. Then she stepped forward and planted the violet near the bench. No fanfare, no photo, just dirt under fingernails and breath caught in her throat. That evening, Sam wrote me a new poem. He titled it, "Roots Don't Ask Permission." It read, "They stretch. Even when the ground says no, they hold. Even when no one sees, they bloom, because they never forgot the sun." I read it 3 times. Then I whispered, "Neither did I." Before bed that night, I added a new line to my journal. "Healing doesn't mean you go back. It means you plant forward." And I knew. I was nearly done writing this story, not because the pain had ended, but because I had finally stopped letting it narrate. The morning the first forget-me-nots bloomed, I didn't cry. I stood there, hands in my coat pockets, scarf loosely wrapped, breath visible in the chill, and simply watched. The petals were small, humble, the kind of flower you might miss if you weren't paying attention. But I noticed, because now I noticed everything. The way sunlight stretched a little longer across the bench. The sound of Claire's daughter giggling while planting tomatoes. The shift in Nathan's voice when he spoke to Sam, lower, steadier, less like a performance, and more like a presence. And above all, I noticed myself, not the woman waiting for recognition, not the mother hoping for reconciliation, but the woman who had come full circle and chose not to stand at the beginning again. That afternoon, I held the final community circle in the garden. Chairs were set up under the arbor. Everyone brought something tea cookies clippings from their own plants. No one had to speak, but many did. Maria shared how she'd started writing letters to herself, apologies for the years she stayed small. Agnes stood and read a list of all the things she'd been told she'd never do after 60, and then ticked off every single one she had done anyway. Celia arrived late but brought news. She had been offered a position at a national advocacy network for elder justice. She turned it down. "I want to stay here," she said, "because this garden matters more than some marble office with a view." I nodded. We didn't need a skyline. We had lavender and forget-me-nots and each other. Near sunset, I stood in front of the group and read aloud one final poem. It wasn't mine. It was Arthur's, tucked at the very back of his journal, written in ink so faint I almost missed it. "If you forget everything, the house, the boy, the weight of silence, remember this." She did not vanish. She grew where they left her. A garden bloomed. There wasn't a sound when I finished, just wind moving through branches like a sigh of relief. Later that evening, I sat with Sam on the porch. We shared apple slices and tea and talked about nothing in particular. He asked, "Do you think Dad will ever be like Grandpa?" I thought about that, then said no, but he might become his own kind of good. Sam looked at the stars. "I think I will too." I smiled. "I know you will." He placed his head on my shoulder. "You can go now, Grandma." You did the whole story. And in that moment, I felt something let go inside me. Not pain, not sorrow, just the need to hold it all so tightly. He was right. The story was whole. Back in my room, I packed a small bag, not because I was leaving, but because I had finally arrived. I used to believe that survival meant staying in the room even when they stopped seeing you, staying quiet when your voice trembled with truth, staying useful so they'd find a reason to keep you around. But now I know survival is not staying. It's returning to your own name, to your own space, to your own rhythm, to the small voice inside you that says, "You do not owe your suffering to the ones who caused it." I gave my son my retirement savings. He told me to live in a shelter, and for a while I believed that maybe I deserved that. That maybe love meant sacrifice without limit. But love with no boundary is not love. It's erasure. So I left. And in that leaving, I discovered something I was never meant to forget. That I am not fragile. I am not disposable. I am not a cautionary tale. I am the woman who built a garden where she was once buried, who turned silence into sanctuary, who taught herself and others to bloom without permission. And if you listening now have ever been made to feel small, unseen, inconvenient, let me offer you this truth. You are not invisible. You are simply waiting to return to yourself. And when you do, let them watch you grow, in full color, in deep roots, in absolute grace. Because sometimes the softest voices write the strongest stories. And this one was mine, Eloise Marwood. For every woman who was told to go away, and instead planted her name in the earth. And let me know if you'd like the full script compiled as a document or want to begin the next story.